Last time, Antiochus had resolved to resume the war against Egypt and retake the city of Seleucia Pieria. Following the death of Ptolemy III Euergetes and the accession of Ptolemy IV Philopator in 222 BC, the Egyptian court had been transformed from a seat of government into a den of excess. Philopator was a young man unconcerned with ruling his empire, but rather preferred to live in luxury, to become drunk with wine, and to waste away his days playing music. Unlike Antiochus, who had to fight against his vizier Hermaeus to wrest control of imperial power, Ptolemy Philopator happily turned over the day-to-day business of government to others within his court. In particular, the affairs of his kingdom were controlled by the concubine and harp player Agathoclea, with whom Ptolemy was infatuated, and in turn her brother Agathocles, who served as a catamite for the king, and later as his chief minister. Their mother, Oanathe, also served as a mistress of Ptolemy, and held influence over him. The other major figure in the court was Cesibius, who was then Ptolemy's vizier. Once Philopator had come to power, Cesibius set about eliminating all other claimants to the throne, so as to secure the position of the king, and thus his own place in the court. Among those killed was Megas, Philopator's younger brother, who was popular with the army. He was murdered in the bath when boiling water was poured over him. Shortly afterwards, the Queen Mother Berenike, that brave woman, was imprisoned and took a fatal poison. Afterwards, Philopator would be haunted by nightmares about her death. Cleomenes, the exiled king of Sparta, had been planning with Ptolemy Euergetes to retake his kingdom and begin a new war against Macedon. He repeatedly petitioned the new Ptolemy for troops and supplies, but Philopator showed little interest in maintaining Ptolemaic influence in Greece. Cesibius, as the real wielder of power, thought any expedition overseas would simply be a waste of money, as if Cleomenes was successful, with his aptitude he could probably secure all of Greece and Macedon, which would be united under a Spartan banner rather than divided among squabbling leagues of cities, and thus prove a greater threat to Egyptian interests. It was also recognised that to dismiss Cleomenes from the court now, empty-handed, would only serve to create a new enemy, who could perhaps go into the service of their rivals, such as the Seleucids. So the Spartan king was confined to his house, and was forbidden from leaving Alexandria. This served to enrage Cleomenes, who now wished to revenge himself upon Ptolemy and die a death worthy of a Spartan. He gave the guards on his house a feast of food and wine, and after gorging themselves they fell asleep. Then Cleomenes and a few companions escaped the house and ran down the streets of Alexandria, calling on the common people to rise up against the despotism of Ptolemy and to seize their freedom. Not one man heeded his call. With this, the Spartans lost all hope, and so, with smiles and good cheer, they killed each other, one by one, until only Pantaeus, a hero of the war against the Achaeans, remained, who kissed the corpse of his king, and then fell on his own sword. Ptolemy had the body of Cleomenes flayed and crucified, and then had the wives and the children of the Spartans put to death. This was the state of affairs in the Egyptian court: constant vice, political murders, and the domination of a disinterested king by corrupt villains. In 219 BC, Antiochus, before he began his assault on Seleucia Pieria, offered money and power to the commanders of the garrison in exchange for their surrender. This attempt was unsuccessful, but not wholly so, as many of the junior officers of the garrison secretly decided to align themselves with the Seleucid cause. An attack on the city was made simultaneously by land and by sea. With escalades against every approachable part of the city walls, the defenders became pinned down and were unable to reposition themselves to reinforce areas which were about to fall. The lower city was captured, which prompted those treacherous junior officers to demand that Leontius, the commander of the Acropolis, negotiate with Antiochus. Leontius agreed to surrender in exchange for guarantees for the safety, property, and rights of the city's population. Antiochus accepted this and placed garrisons in the harbour and in the Acropolis. Now that Seleucia Pieria had been taken, the next logical move would be to once again attack south and attempt to take Syria. But before any plans could be drawn up, Antiochus received a message sent by Theodotus of Aetolia, the Ptolemaic commander who had halted the Seleucid advance at Gera 2 years earlier. In the aftermath of that battle, Theodotus had not received a word of thanks from Ptolemy, but rather had since begun to fear for his position and his life after the deaths of Megas and Cleomenes. In his letter, Theodotus offered Antiochus his service and invited the king to occupy the cities he commanded, but he stressed that the Seleucid army would have to arrive quickly before the other Ptolemaic forces could react. Antiochus once again marched down the length of the Marsyas Valley and encamped near Gera. Theodotus, who was in the city of Ptolemais, modern Acre, was under siege from Nicolaus, another Ptolemaic general, and sent for aid. Antiochus immediately took his light troops and marched to the relief of the city, with Nicolaus withdrawing at the king's approach. Antiochus took control of Ptolemais and Tyre, along with 40 Egyptian warships stationed there. Thereafter, Antiochus began to gradually make his way down the Levantine coast, taking what cities he could, while simply bypassing those which would be too time-consuming to take. Ptolemy Philopator's absentee kingship had left the state totally unprepared for such a war. A shocking change given the heights of success Egypt had reached in the previous conflict a generation earlier. Ptolemy began mustering an army at Pelusium, on the extreme north edge of the Nile Delta, but it would take time to assemble and train a force which could oppose the Seleucid army. To this end, Agathocles and Cesibius began sending envoys to Byzantium, Rhodes, Cyzicus, and the Aetolian League in order to gain neutral arbitrators for negotiations with Antiochus, which were held in Memphis. The Egyptians were not attending the negotiations in good faith, but simply to stall for time as much as possible. While their negotiators were at work, vast sums were spent on mercenaries, with soldiers and officers being hired from all over the Greek world. However, most notably, the prescription against enlisting native Egyptians, which had been established by Ptolemy I, was ignored, with 20,000 native Egyptian phalangites being trained. Antiochus by now had reached the town of Dora, in the far south of Phoenicia. Nicolaus ably led the defence there against the Seleucids, with Antiochus making little progress. Given this, and given winter was approaching, the Seleucid king acceded to an armistice for a period of 4 months. Then Antiochus decamped, and the army withdrew to Seleucia, after leaving garrisons in the captured cities. The Ptolemaic negotiating strategy had been more successful than they had expected, as Antiochus now believed that the Egyptians had no intentions of meeting him in a decisive battle, that the war would be resolved through negotiation, and that his victory was a fait accompli. Throughout this armistice, while Antiochus and his men were relaxing, the Ptolemaic troops were constantly training, and their blacksmiths were forging more weapons. The negotiations continued at Seleucia Pieria. This choice of venue was a clear signal by Antiochus that Seleucia was considered an integral part of the empire, and that he would not be returning it under any circumstances. During these talks, Antiochus claimed that his actions were justified, as Colle Syria had been assigned to Seleucus Nicator after the Battle of Ipsus, and was unjustly seized by Ptolemy I. The Ptolemaic negotiators took a completely contrary position, calling Antiochus a treaty violator, and claiming that Seleucus freely gave Colle Syria to Ptolemy. Two claims of very questionable validity. Neither side was open to compromise, and as a result, no real ground was ever made when it came to establishing a negotiated peace. Once winter had ended and the armistice was concluded, the war resumed in earnest. Nicolaus led a force northward until he reached Porphyrion, to the north of Sidon. He fortified the narrow pass along the coastline there and awaited Antiochus. Antiochus marched south again, taking some cities and razing others, until he came to Porphyrion. After sending out Theodotus and Nicarchus to scout the enemy position, Antiochus moved to engage the Ptolemaic force. Simultaneously, the Seleucid and Ptolemaic navies met in the seas just offshore, although that engagement was indecisive. On the land, the battle was hard fought, with Nicolaus's men holding their ground. However, the left flank under Theodotus managed to wrest control of the heights from the enemy, and then turned and attacked downhill into the flank of the Ptolemaic centre, which led to a general rout. At least 2,000 Egyptian soldiers were killed, and that many again captured. The remaining men and the fleet retreated south to Sidon. Antiochus decided against investing the city, but instead bypassed it and pressed his advantage south, occupying the cities of Scythopolis and Philoteria near the Sea of Galilee, while the navy sailed on to Tyre. The king then seized the fortified settlement on Mount Tabor by luring out and ambushing the garrison there. In the face of these defeats, the morale on the Ptolemaic side reached an all-time low. One commander, Chaereas, defected, for which Antiochus showered him with riches. This show of liberality encouraged the defection of other officers, with a Thessalian named Hippolochus going over to the Seleucid side with 400 cavalrymen. City after city fell to Antiochus, Pella, Camus, and Gephroas, consolidating his hold over the Jezreel Valley. The Seleucids then crossed the Jordan, where they were welcomed by many of the Arabs there and faced little resistance. A force of local Ptolemaic soldiers gathered at Rabbatamana, whence they launched raids against the Arabs who had joined the Seleucid side. Antiochus came to their aid and besieged the town. 2 approaches to the wall were identified, and competing sets of siege works were set up, one by Theodotus, one by Nicarchus. The commanders, each seeking to outdo the other, rapidly breached the walls. However, all their exploratory attacks into the city were repelled due to the concentration of troops within it. A captured Ptolemaic soldier eventually revealed that the garrison was drawing their water from a spring reached via an underground passage. The besieging army then mined a tunnel to intersect this passage, which they caved in, depriving the city of water. Rabbatamana surrendered shortly thereafter. Winter was now once again approaching, so after garrisoning the city and dispatching troops to Samaria, Antiochus marched with the main force back to Ptolemais to encamp for the season. In the spring of 217 BC, Ptolemy felt that his army was sufficient to fight Antiochus in a pitched battle, so he at last advanced out of Egypt, encamping near Raphia, the closest city in Colé, Syria, to Egypt. Antiochus came from the other direction with his men, briefly stopped at Gaza, and then encamped just a mile away from Ptolemy. After a few days, Antiochus advanced his camp half as close again, which led to regular skirmishes between foraging and water-gathering parties. One night, Theodotus put into action a cunning plan. Just before dawn, he and 2 other men entered the Ptolemaic camp and made their way to the royal pavilions, evading every watchman. While he was able to find the command tent, Theodotus was unable to pinpoint Ptolemy's sleeping quarters and had to make his escape, but not before wounding 2 attendants and killing the king's physician. After being encamped together for 5 days, the 2 armies finally assembled for battle. Ptolemy had with him 70,000 infantry, almost all of whom were phalangites, 5,000 cavalry, and 73 elephants. As an aside, the elephants in the Ptolemaic army were African, but the precise species or subspecies is a matter of some debate. The Ptolemies hunted their elephants from the lands near the southwest coast of the Red Sea, probably in modern Eritrea, though the exact location is unknown. It is stated by Polybius that these African elephants were smaller in size than the Asian elephants used by the Seleucids, but the only extant populations of elephants in that region of Africa are savanna elephants, which are significantly larger in size than their oriental brethren. So the options are that either Polybius is wrong, and the general understanding that the ancients did not interact with savanna elephants is incorrect, or that the smaller species of African forest elephants, or North African elephants, if they were a distinct subspecies, were extant in the region during the Hellenistic Age, and were hunted to extinction, as the North African elephants were. The latter option seems more historically consistent and practical than the former, but unless we do find surviving elephant remains from that period in order to do DNA testing, we will likely never know for sure. Ptolemy deployed his phalangites in the centre, with his few lighter infantry and archers on the flanks, and with his cavalry on the extremes of each flank. 40 of his elephants were deployed in front of his left wing, where Ptolemy himself was, with the remaining 33 on the right wing. Antiochus' army was slightly smaller than Ptolemy's. He had 62,000 infantry, only about half of which were phalangites, 6,000 cavalry, and 102 elephants. Antiochus' infantry lined up in opposition to Ptolemy's, with a third of the cavalry and 42 of the elephants on the left wing, while Antiochus led the right flank with 4,000 cavalry and 60 elephants. Both kings gave speeches to their armies, but on account of their ages, they could not point to great personal deeds, so they called on their men to recall the glorious history of their respective empires. Arsinoe, Ptolemy's sister wife, exhorted the men to protect their wives and children, and promised them each 2 minas of gold if they were victorious. Trumpets were sound and battle was made. The elephants charged together, with the great beasts goring one another, while their mahouts stabbed at each other with spears. The smaller Ptolemaic elephants were disturbed by the smell of the Seleucid Asian elephants, which eventually caused the Ptolemaic elephants to break and flee into their own lines, causing havoc. While this was happening, Antiochus led his cavalry around the Ptolemaic flank and engaged the cavalry there, with the Seleucid horsemen handily outdoing their Egyptian counterparts. Ptolemy's right wing, despite the defeat of their elephants, found success, routing the Seleucid cavalry there, while Ptolemy's Greek mercenaries put to flight Antiochus' Arabians and Medes. While the wings were engaged, the centre had yet to fight, until Cesibius advanced the Ptolemaic phalangites forward to the Seleucid line. Ptolemy himself had slipped away from Antiochus' mounted onslaught and had joined the phalangites, with his presence improving their morale. The superior Egyptian numbers paid dividends, and they pushed the Seleucid infantry back. Antiochus, being unaware of all this, and having tasted success in his battle, continued to chase down the fleeing Ptolemaic cavalry, possibly believing that Ptolemy was still among them. After a while, one of his officers advised him to stop, pointing out how far they had ridden from the battle. Antiochus recognized this, and turned back, but by the time he had returned to the field, Ptolemy's victorious right flank had swung around to join in the assault on the Seleucid centre, and under such pressure the line had buckled and collapsed, and the Seleucid army had been broken. This had been a decisive victory for Ptolemy. Antiochus had lost over 10,000 men dead, and another 4,000 captured, while the pharaoh had only lost 2,200 men. Antiochus and his men withdrew to Raphia, and then to Gaza, after which both sides agreed to a truce to bury their dead. And then the Seleucid army marched all the way back to Antioch, gathering up their garrisons as they went. Fearing a new attack by Achaeus from Anatolia, Antiochus sent an embassy to Ptolemy to negotiate a peace. While Ptolemy was thrilled with his victory, he had no interest in tempting fate with another battle in an effort to conquer Syria, but simply desired to return to his life of carefree leisure. He sent Cesibius to Antioch to negotiate on his behalf, and a mutual peace was agreed on, with Antiochus surrendering Syria, although the topic of handing over Seleucia Pieria to the Ptolemies was not even broached. Ptolemy ordered grand celebrations across his realm, with sacrifices of thanksgiving being made to the gods, and then he and Cesibius spent a few months reorganizing and reincorporating Syria. According to the 3rd book of Maccabees, Ptolemy visited Jerusalem at this time and wished to enter the Holy of Holies in the Jewish temple. The king was informed that such a thing was impermissible by law, but Ptolemy attempted to anyway, at which point he was smote down and his body was paralyzed, with his attendants having to carry him out of the temple. The king was incensed by this and began issuing decrees against the Jews. When he returned to Alexandria, he gathered together all of the Jews in the city and took them to the hippodrome, where he unleashed his elephants on them. 2 angels then appeared and frightened the elephants, causing them to stampede into the assembled Ptolemaic soldiers instead. After witnessing this miracle, a shaken Ptolemy released the captured Jews and revoked his decrees against them. In Illyria, Demetrius of Pharos, although ostensibly a Roman ally, noticed that the Romans were distracted fighting the Gauls in the Po Valley, and he decided to resume the traditional Illyrian piratical raiding despite its prohibition by treaty. When this violation went unpunished, Demetrius was emboldened to attack their Illyrian possessions. In this, he was initially successful, razing a number of Roman-controlled towns. In response, in 219 BC, the Romans dispatched a force under the consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Demetrius strongly fortified the cities of Damale and Pharos and waited for the Roman attack. Without hesitation, Paulus attacked Damale and took the fortress in only a week, the shock of which compelled many cities to turn themselves over to the Romans immediately. Next, an attack on Pharos itself was made. Most of the Roman troops landed in a forested part of the island, under the cover of night, where they hid. Once day came, the remaining Romans openly sailed up to Pharos, and began disembarking in front of the town. Demetrius, knowing he could defeat such a minute force, sallied out of the city to engage them. The soldiers who had landed in the night now made themselves known, and took a position between the Illyrian army and the city, cutting off their line of retreat. The Illyrians charged at these Romans, trying to break their lines and return to the city. Those who had just disembarked did not simply stand and watch, but assaulted the Illyrian rear, encircling and crushing them. Pharos was then razed to the ground, while Demetrius boarded a ship and fled to the court of Philip V at Pella. Paulus quickly reorganized the captured territories under new Roman allies, and then returned to Italy, as a new war against Carthage appeared imminent. In Greece, following the death of Antigonus Doson and the accession of Philip V to the Macedonian throne, the region fell back into conflict. The Aetolian League, seeking to take advantage of the king's youth and inexperience, began a new war against the Achaean League, who had after all only been saved from defeat at Spartan hands by Macedonian intervention. In the years after the last war, the Achaean strategos, Timoxenas, with the Peloponnese being weary of war, had made no preparations for future conflict. So the initial Aetolian raids in 220 BC on Patras and Dyme met no opposition. Timoxenas' term had nearly expired, so the Achaeans once again called upon Aratus to lead them in war, granting him the seal of office 5 days before his term should have begun. Aratus summoned the soldiers of the League to meet at Megalopolis, and marched to meet the Aetolians near Caphiae. There the Achaeans allowed the Aetolians to take up a position on the higher ground and charge downhill, which resulted in a general rout of the whole Achaean force. This defeat prompted the Achaean assembly to once again request Macedonian intervention. At the same time, the Spartans, seeking vengeance for their previous defeat, formed a secret alliance with the Aetolians. Without warning, in 219 BC, the Lacedaemonians invaded Argolis and seized several towns. In the meantime, Philip marched from Macedon with a force of 15,800 men. In the Peloponnese, the Spartan advance continued, while the Aetolians plundered still more cities. Despairing at the lack of aid from the rest of the League, Patras, Dyme, and Tritaea, themselves founding members, repudiated their obligations to the League and began hiring mercenaries to defend themselves. Philip arrived in southern Epirus, with the levy of the Epirot League joining his army. The king then seized Ambracia, which he turned over to the Epirots. Meanwhile, the Aetolians had marched into Thessaly, burnt the crops of Pieria, and despoiled the sacred sanctuary at Dion, the news of which enraged Philip. He continued into Aetolian territory, razing the towns of Metropolis, Canope, Ithoria, and Paeonium, and seizing Oniade, which he fortified to use as a base. Then the word came that the Dardani were gathering for yet another invasion of Macedonia, so Philip turned his army around and marched back to Pella. Upon hearing of his return, the Dardani abandoned their designs. With the Macedonians gone, the Aetolians counterattacked the Epirots, pillaging the land and razing the sacred temple at Dodona. Winter had now come, and the campaigning season had ended. However, Philip secretly took a small force to Corinth and summoned the Achaeans to join him. Taking the Aetolians and their allies in the Peloponnese completely by surprise, Philip inflicted a number of defeats upon them and ravaged the territory of the Aetolian-aligned city of Elis. In the summer of 218 BC, after briefly campaigning in the Ionian Islands, Philip sailed to Aetolia itself, coming to the sanctuary of Thermon, the annual election place of the Aetolian League. There, in an act of rash vengeance for the desecrations of Dion and Dodona, Philip razed their temples, tore down over 2,000 statues, and took a great deal of booty. After ransacking the surrounding countryside, Philip marched out of Aetolia before their army could return, and sailed back to Corinth. From there he went south all the way to Lacedaemonia, sacking many undefended towns there. Having shown that the Spartans could not oppose him, Philip returned to Corinth. There, several of Philip's officers stirred up trouble, inciting the men to revolt by telling them that they had not received enough plunder for themselves. Philip put down this uprising and executed the ringleaders, but the news of this internal strife encouraged the Aetolians to continue the war, despite the setbacks they had faced. In 217 BC, while the Achaean League was having their annual meeting, the Aetolians and the Eleans attacked, reaching all the way to Aegium, the meeting place of the League. As the Aetolians were withdrawing with their plunder, they were attacked at Leontion by the Achaean general Lycus, who killed 400 men, took 2,000 prisoner, and captured all of their baggage. The war so far had resulted in no significant gains for any side, but had resulted in the general devastation of Greece. While Philip was attending the Nemean Games at Argos, astonishing news now reached him. The Romans had been utterly crushed in battle by the Carthaginian general Hannibal. Demetrius of Pharos advised the king to make peace in Greece and take advantage of this opportunity to seize Illyria and invade Italy itself. Philip was persuaded, and a council was called to negotiate a truce. Agelaus, an Aetolian leader, made a speech to the assembled officials calling for peace. He pointed out that whosoever won the war in Italy, whether Roman or Carthaginian, they would eventually turn their attention to Greece. Therefore, the Greeks should cease the wars amongst themselves and instead unite to oppose the barbarians. With this, the social war came to an end, and Philip, with the backing of the rest of Greece, turned his attention to the west. In Anatolia, a small conflict had been ongoing between the Pisidian cities of Pednelissus and Selgae. The Pednelicians called on Achaeus, the rebel ruler of most of Anatolia, to protect them, and he quickly sent the general Garciarus with 6,500 men to break the siege. The Atenaeus and the Aspendans both sent troops to aid Garciarus. Pednelissus was now running out of food, so the general dispatched 2,000 men carrying bushels of wheat under the cover of night to sneak into the city. However, the Selgians intercepted and slaughtered them. Emboldened, the Selgians attacked Garciarus' camp, but were put to flight, and 10,000 of them were killed. In Selgae there was a great panic, and a council was called to appoint a negotiator. The chosen man was Logbaesus, who had been a friend of the late Antiochus Hyrax. But when Logbaesus met with Garciarus in private, he promised to treacherously turn Selgae over to Achaeus personally. This was agreed, and the king was sent for. Once he arrived, Logbaesus called on the citizens to have an assembly to discuss surrender to Achaeus. While all the people of the city were at the assembly, Achaeus marched upon the city, while Garciarus marched on the Acropolis. A goatherd spotted this advance and warned the people, who, enraged, raced to Logbaesus' house and put him and his whole household to death, and then manned the walls and repulsed the assault. After this, a truce was agreed, with the Selgians to pay an indemnity of 700 talents. While this was happening, Attalus, the king of Pergamon, hired a group of Galatian mercenaries and secured control of the rest of Aeolus, after which many cities defected to him, including much of Ionia and Mysia. While campaigning in Mysia, on the 1st of September 218 BC, a lunar eclipse occurred, which the Galatians viewed as a bad omen, and as such refused to carry on. Attalus did not wish to turn the Galatians against him and lose their services in the future, so he acceded to their wishes, gave them lands, and discharged them on good terms. In early 216 BC, after having returned to Pergamon, a letter arrived, which had been sent from Antiochus. The Seleucid king was preparing for another war, and requested an alliance with Pergamon against Achaeus. Attalus readily accepted this offer, and made himself ready for war. Next time, while Greece turns west to face off against the Romans, Antiochus will cross the Taurus Mountains to deal with Achaeus. If you have any comments, criticism, or questions, please post them below, and thank you for listening.